to our presentation, The Future in Our Pockets, Making Money Work for the Common Good. This presentation is co-sponsored by the Alliance for Just Money and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, U.S. section, known as WILF. WILF is the oldest international women's peace organization in the world, founded in 1915 by Jane Addams of Hull House and brave international women who sailed across dangerous waters to The Hague and visited with every European head of state to try to stop World War I. The International Women's Congress they helped found laid the groundwork for the League of Nations and subsequently the United Nations, where WILF still enjoys consultative status. WILF was instrumental in proposing and gaining approval for the International Declaration on Human Rights and the Geneva Convention, and has been working continuously for disarmament, nuclear abolition, human rights, women's rights, and economic and environmental justice. Our National Issue Committee, Women, Money, and Democracy, focuses on creating a democracy and an economy that works for all of us, especially women and families. I'll put that link into the chat in a little bit. Our projects on public banking, corporate power, and centering the role of women in a more caring feminist economy help point us towards that goal. Our work to make the economy fairer, less dependent on war and extractive industries, and more caring led us to work with Alliance for Just Money, because increasingly we understand that money, as it's been created and distributed now, really is a root cause of oppression, deliberate division, racism, and conflict. We understand that an alternative world is possible, and transforming our money system is one way to get there. Mary Sanderson, who you'll hear from in a moment, often asks us to imagine how a more equitable money system with less crushing debt and the stresses that that brings could enable us to be the generous and caring people we're meant to be, that we want to be, but that fear and a sense of lack keep us from being. She talks about how a new monetary system could support the concept of deep abundance that comes from a shared understanding of how we're all connected and how we could be working together for change if we weren't afraid. So our goal tonight is just to begin this dialogue, to point out how transforming the system could lead us to the common good, and to normalize the idea of what some believe are radical changes. We believe this dialogue is both brave and necessary. So let's get started. We'll have a question and answer slide segment at the end of the presentation. So as we go along, please note your questions and hold them to the end. Right now, I want to introduce Lucille Eckrich, Virginia Hammond, and WILF's own Mary Sanderson.
Hello, I'm Mary Sanderson. I grew up and live now in the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk people in Wisconsin. Thankfully, the Ho-Chunk always came back, and their elders keep reminding us about protecting the web of life. My interest in the money system goes back to growing up on that Wisconsin farm in the 50s. My dad used to say, money is like manure. It's only good when you spread it around. He understood that through the decades, we were being driven off the land. He knew it had something to do with the banks, but he could not put his finger on the problem. It's exciting for me as a member of WILF's Women, Money, and Democracy Committee and the Alliance for Just Money to help Lucille and Virginia tonight introduce this fascinating problem and to invite you all to collaborate on what to do about it.
So I'm Lucille Eckrich, a retired professor from Illinois State University and a sibling, a spouse, a mother, and a grandmother. I've lived many places, the longest stints being on Long Island, New York, Worcester, Ohio, Pitsing, Botswana, Buffalo, New York, and Chicago, Illinois. But since 2001, we lived in central Illinois on lands first inhabited by the Kickapoo, the Kaskaskia, the Peoria, the Oshesikawi, and the Mia Mia peoples, to whom we owe much. My path to monetary critique and reform was through recycling, hunger, and justice work from middle school through my 20s, that led me with questions to graduate school in my 30s, questions that I answered in my 1998 dissertation on value in economics, ethics, and education. And through it, I discerned that our systemic problem lies in how we do modern money and banking. And I've been working on that alongside making a living ever since, and full time after retiring in 2020. Virginia.
For some reason, it's not letting me move. Oh, there we go.
Maybe get out of full screen. Yeah, there you go. Oh, there you go.
Well, hi, I'm Virginia Hammond. I'm a mother, grandmother, educator, and an activist from Portland, Oregon, the traditional village sites and gathering places of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes and bands. I may be unusual in that I'm in the home I grew up in. I went from kindergarten through college within a 2-mile radius, and then spent almost 7 years in the Middle East and almost 20 in Hawaii before returning home. This gave me strong roots and an international and intercultural perspective. I served on the board of the Alliance for Just Money and have written 2 books about the money system available on howwepay.us. I care deeply about the future and share your commitment for peace, freedom, democracy, and the preservation and rehabilitation of our planet.
What is the money system? What does it do? How is it relevant to WILT women? And why consider reform? We come together with a strong sense of what constitutes the common good. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, founded in 1915, like Mary Beth said, it envisioned a world of permanent peace and freedom, founded on feminist foundations of freedom, justice, nonviolence, human rights, and equality for all, where people, planet, and all other inhabitants coexist and flourish in harmony. That's a solid definition of common good, and one that the Alliance for Just Money shares. We're here to snag your interest in why our money system stands in the way of achieving our vision for the common good, and how it can be changed to support it. WILT addresses all kinds of violence: racial justice, corruption, the growing wealth gap, climate catastrophes. History shows that money systems can be designed either to advance special interests or to support healing and caring economies. If the money system is a big factor in all that violence, WILT women need to know about it. Tonight is the preview. We'll invite you then to a study group to consider more deeply why changing the money system could help us to flourish in harmony, and how historically it actually has been done. What is money? A human invention, a social technology based on agreement and trust, and used to represent value in the exchange of goods and services. We all have stories about not enough money, or when some corporation has so much, it can pollute rivers with impunity. While we're concerned about having enough, we rarely think about where it comes from or its original purpose. It turns out money creation is not a neutral thing. As a social agreement, it comes in many forms that represent different value constellations. We need to be choosy about the money system we use because it's such a substantial part of our lives, and the system's values define society's norms. Think competition versus collaboration, or protection versus destruction.
So now let's look more closely at our money system. Data on the graphs that we're going to show you come from the Fed unless they're labeled otherwise. So before quite thinking about this slide, which shows the US money supply from 1960 to the present, note that the money supply in any money system is not static. It can and even should increase and decrease to accommodate changes in population or in productivity. But as this graph shows, in our money system, the supply only grows, and increasingly so over time, from 1960 on the left to the present on the right. That's a significant, that growth of the money supply is a significant but rarely told part of the inflation story that is front page news today. Part of the reason for inflation is the constant growth of the money supply. So who creates all this money? Where does it come from? What agency or agencies are creating it? The government, the Federal Reserve, private banks, or maybe you don't have a clue. So there should have just popped up on your screen a poll. Please do it now if your best answer to that question. We'll give you a moment. Good, it looks like half of you have found the poll and done it. Getting close to a third. Looks like most people here know something about money. Few more seconds. Last 10 people. All answers make sense. Okay. 5 seconds for the last 5. Okay. Let's see if we can share the results here, and we'll see what our collective sense making of the system is. Can you see the results now?
Yes.
Okay. So it looks like a little more than half chose the private banks. A good 25% chose the Federal Reserve. A little bit fewer chose the government, and an honest 6 few here, 6% said, I don't have a clue. So I think that suggests that people in the crowd here know a little bit more than when we did this poll some years ago, but we're still a bit all over the place a little bit. And so to answer the question that we posed correctly, at least, it's really helpful to realize that there are different kinds of forms of money in our system, as is depicted on the screen here. And there is a common belief that across the broader society that government creates all this money. And for those of you who did answer government, you are partly right. The US Mint makes coins. And since the face value of most coins is more than the cost of producing them, just not for pennies and nickels, the Treasury makes a little profit on producing coins. And if you chose the Federal Reserve, you too are partly right. The bills, the dollar bills, are printed by the Treasury within the Bureau of Printing and Engraving, but they're sold at cost to the Federal Reserve. And the Fed is the one who really issues them at face value to commercial banks as needed. And commercial banks make them available to you and me in exchange for our account money. And the third kind of money is that last thing I said, and it's by far the greatest amount, is account money. Account money lives in the checking accounts that we use to pay our bills and get paid, and in our savings accounts, and in the bank's accounts at the Fed. And the sum of all bills, coins, and account money is the total money supply circulating in the economy. Bills and coins comprise about 5% of our money supply, and all the rest is account money. And that could make some sense if you think about how you spend and earn your money. But here's the kicker. All account money is created by private banks, not by the government. And a little more than 50% of you here already knew that. Good for you. That means we're getting somewhere in our work, because people didn't used to know this. So banks create new money with every loan they make. The Fed also creates account money when it loans to its member banks, which it's done increasingly since the 2008 recession. So that 95% of our money supply, that's all account money. It's all created by banks, most of it by private commercial banks. That might strike some of you as preposterous. We thought it was when we first heard about it. I suspect the 50% of you here who also knew it found it a pretty surprising too, but it's true. And so that common belief that the government creates the money, it's a myth that protects this system that we have. And if you need further confirmation about that banks create our money, a booklet called Modern Money Mechanics, published by the Chicago Fed in 1994, explained it. And in their words, they said the actual process of money creation takes place primarily in banks when the proceeds from loans made by banks are credited to borrowers' accounts. So now you know the bulk of our money, all account money denominated as US dollars, is not created by the government, whether by Congress or the Treasury, but by the banking system when they make loans. So if private banks have the power to add and subtract account money from the money supply, how do they do it? And how does it work? Well, the US Constitution in Article 1, Section 8 assigns the power to create the national money to Congress. This power was subcontracted to the private commercial banks with the 1913 Federal Reserve Act. That's almost 110 years ago.
So to understand how the system works, let's compare the core difference between the way people and businesses lend to each other and the way that banks lend. A simple difference in accounting gives banks the awesome power and privilege to create and control our money supply. So you and I and the businesses we frequent understand how money works for us. We keep track of debit cards, bills, and account balances. We keep track of our income and expenses on what is called a cash flow ledger. We keep track of what we own and what we owe on a balance sheet. And it's on the balance sheet of assets, liabilities, and equity where the accounting difference lies. So let's say we start with $1,000. That's an asset we own. Now, if we want to lend a sister to a sister, we get cash or write a check and subtract the amount needed from our checking account. We have to manage without that money until sis pays back. The amount of money circulating in our town does not change when we make that loan to our sister, but the amount of money in our account goes down. In our accounts, we subtracted a cash asset and replaced it with an IOU asset. Well, now let's look at what a bank does on its balance sheet.
Selection and deals.
All businesses keep ledgers of what they own and what they owe, and that is called the balance sheet because their assets and liabilities must match. Businesses include equity, the net of what the business owns, on the liability side because it's considered owed to the shareholders by the business. Among businesses, only banks may legally use a special accounting system on their balance sheets. So let's look at the balance sheet of a bank that starts out with the same $1,000 you did. Now, of course, banks have many, 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 many more zeros. Here's a bank in the same financial position you were before you made a loan. The bank has $1,000 cash and no liabilities. So a net or equity of $1,000. Well, let's see what happens when a bank makes a loan. A bank does not need the $1,000 in existing money in its possession to loan you $1,000. Banks are uniquely allowed to enter your IOU for your loan contract amount, $1,000, in their asset column without subtracting any amount from their own cash. They simultaneously enter the loan principal on the liability side in customer deposits, for instance, your personal checking account. This creates a matching liability for their balance sheet. The bank owes you that amount. Of course, you could take your money in cash or deposit it in another bank or spend it. And as money circulates, the banks function as a collective whole. It takes a little longer to explain all the steps in that collective process, but fundamentally and systemically, this is it all over the world. And note, the net or equity of the bank remains the same. It still only has $1,000. However, their balance sheet has lengthened. Banks' account assets and liabilities grow line by line as they create money. Instead of one entry in assets, there are now two entries, and assets have doubled to $2,000. Liabilities have increased from nothing to $1,000. The money supply has grown. In this case, it has doubled from $1,000 in just the bank's hands to $2,000 in the bank and in your hands. Well, roughly 95% of the money that we use today is created in this way. To give you a sense of what this privilege and power to create the money supply looks like, let's take a quick look at the balance sheet of a real bank. This is a very abbreviated look at JP Morgan Chase's 2021 financial report. JP Morgan Chase is the largest bank in the United States and the second largest in the world. JP Morgan Chase has total assets of $3,744 billion, liabilities of $3,449 billion, giving them a net equity of $294 billion. That reported equity includes preferred stock, goodwill, and other intangible assets. Keeping in mind the previous slide about how banks create money, this slide tells us that JP Morgan Chase has created roughly $3 trillion in account money, literally by keystrokes. Here's another useful way to look at that summary. We've seen that Chase's assets minus its liabilities means Chase has 294 billion in equity. If we subtract the intangible assets, the value of preferred stock and goodwill is really an estimate that may be wishful. So a tangible common equity remains of just 211 billion. On its income and expense statements, which we have not shown, JP Morgan Chase reports that its net income in 2021 was $48 billion. So with 211 billion in tangible assets, that's their equity, that's what they actually own, the bank generates a net income of 48 billion. Their return on tangible common equity is 23%. How many businesses do you know that can bring in a 23% annual return on equity? The power to create the national money supply and collect interest on it is a privilege that no other business has. It's easy to see why the financial sector dominates and controls the economy and politics, and why the financial sector reaps nearly 30% of all corporate profits. That big number on the screen, 975 billion, is an estimate of how much interest income the investor class makes in 1 year on a $19.5 trillion money supply, if the interest rate was averaged 5%. The transfer of wealth is staggering. This is an enormous and unnecessary burden on the productive economy. Imagine what that 975 billion could pay for in improvements on the commons. So where did all the new money go? We can take a close look at that in questions after our presentation or in a study group. For now, we all know that it did not trickle down. It went mostly to the wealthiest Americans. Money reformers insist this power and privilege to control the supply of money and the benefits therefrom rightly belong to we, the people. It should support the commons rather than constantly extract from it.
When banks have the power to add and subtract money from the supply today, and they do so by making interest-bearing loans, what are the consequences? We look forward to a study group about the wide-ranging effects of the current money system has on us, environmental, social, and individual. Tonight, a sampling. Any money system affects the distribution of wealth and power. We have seen how our privately controlled system depends on debt to concentrate wealth and power. Because money affects politicians, media, and public opinion, more wealth leads to more power. Political and judicial decisions bend to wealth. Government and finance are locked in a wrestler's bear hug. If we humans are serious about self-government, we the people need to hold the purse strings. After this first century of wealth consolidation under the Federal Reserve System, finance seems to be winning the match. We'll consider a few specific effects of our current system tonight, but we're giving extra time to debt, which is really at the core. Currently, money creation requires additional debt to accommodate interest payments on old debt. More money requires more and more debt. That's what we've got. Now, as Congress debates the debt ceiling, it's important for us to remember that the system itself demands this increasing debt. Here's the US federal government debt from the 1960s to the present. Notice the increase in the debt roughly follows the curve of the money supply graph that we saw earlier. It's growing exponentially. And here's the debt of the non-financial sectors of the economy from the 1960s to 2020. From the bottom up, Blue is business debt, green is household debt, purple federal, and red is state and local government debt. Again, notice that curve. Lending plays an important role in society for a purchase of large items like houses and cars and for investment purposes. But lending need not be coupled with money creation. Banks can lend existing money on behalf of depositors who want to invest, or they can lend from their own equity. That's what investment banks do now. Ending bank creation of money closes one major flow of money from the many to the few. Here's a graph of money in circulation compared to aggregate debt in the US as of the end of 2021. The left column is green, money in its several forms, and the right column is debt in red, broken down into household debt at the bottom, then business debt, then federal government, and state and local government debt at the top. That is $65 trillion of debt burden on everybody, while there's barely $20 billion in circulation. In this system, there are a couple of hardwired reasons why debt is so much greater than money. One is that we said already, you cannot create money in the system without creating debt. Another is a lot of the new money, debt money that is created, is done solely to pay interest on older debt. A vicious cycle. It's like Bloody Marys for a hangover. It all kind of works like a vacuum cleaner right now, and that's on purpose. This slide illustrates the values of our current money system. Households, firms, and the government sector all funnel money directly to wealthy investors. It's no wonder that dystopian future fiction is so popular. The most delicious part of the study group we propose is the what if part, where we get to let our imaginations go to work on possible healing futures. Highlights would be, what if we get a money system whose purpose is to keep wealth circulating for creativity and caring rather than to flow away? What if banks' special privilege to monetize debt were halted? That would pull the plug on the vacuum cleaner. I hope you can see this could be fun. What if governments were no longer beholden to financiers for their budgets? Virginia has an example right now of the flow of money to investors from her city.
Well, let me introduce you to my hometown's current budget. Portland has $5.4 billion in resources, some of which comes from the state and federal government. We set aside $721 million for debt service. We pay $555 million directly out of our pocket, and then we must set aside another $166 million in case interest rates on debts rise. 13% of Portland's total budget is set aside for debt service. I suspect if you check your own city or state budgets, you'll find a similar story. Under this system, it really is a no-brainer to form a public bank that can provide financing at a much cheaper cost and keep the money in our towns. However, a public bank will not change the overall weight of a debt money system where money is created mostly by private bankers driven by a profit motive. Now, this slide shows the impact of that debt on the city of Portland. Like many cities, Portland needs more funding for childcare, mass transit, affordable housing, and so on. Water, as you can see on this, is the biggest expense, and that makes sense. Water is the staff of life. It should be a priority. But management and finance comes in at second place and debt at number 3. We spend more on debt service than on each of the other departments that make a city healthy and prosperous. And the federal government is in the same situation with bigger numbers. In 2022, with 3.4 trillion in taxes collected and 7.7 trillion in expenses, the US Treasury borrowed an additional 4.3 trillion and paid 497 billion for interest on the federal debt. They just published this financial report for 2022 this past week. So yesterday I updated this slide. The amount of interest paid went up roughly $100 billion. Compare that 100 billion going to private, and that in additional $100 billion going to private investors with the Department of Justice's budget at only 41 billion, or energy's budget at 43 billion, or the Environmental Protection Agency at just 9 billion. Yow. Remember, this debt is a necessary part of the money system today. All the talk about reducing the government debt is a charade intended to cut expenditures even further for the common good and pushing more and more people into debt. When proposals come before government for spending on the common good, the question is always raised: can we afford these things? Especially in view of the already very high debt. But really, is there a good reason a government should pay interest to banks in order to provide infrastructure and services to its citizens?
So we've looked at the debt. What are other consequences? A system that gives a few private parties the privilege of creating the money and that requires interest-bearing debt is a system of endemic injustice. Debt is an unequal relationship. Today, private bankers determine who gets the first use of new money and for what. That is power over others and over the course of the country's development too. To keep high profits coming, the system supports the idea that it is okay to treat many people as exploitable or expendable. This injustice wastes the potential contributions of the many and thereby reduces the creativity and innovation that are what makes for a vibrant and healthy economy. This injustice creates stress, which makes for poor health, and life potential is wasted. And injustice leads to violence. The system is violent and it leads to violence. Do you know that there's a light bulb that was designed, built, and screwed into its socket in 1901 in Livermore, California, and it is still shining today, its light? The story is that that light bulb, that the light bulb manufacturers of it got together and they all agreed to produce bulbs that would burn out sooner rather than later so that they could grow their businesses. And so it goes. In 2023, we make more, build more, buy more, and waste more. Underpinning our growth-dependent economy is a growth-dependent money system. The growth imperative is baked into how we do money. Governments all over the world aim for increasing their economies by 2 to 3% every year. And the media reports on economic growth every day, and they're happy. It seems if economic growth is high. The system cannot afford a slow growth or no growth period because it would make paying back debt and the interest on it very difficult and leave inadequate money in circulation if it was paid. However, young people who are concerned about extinctions and environmental disasters don't buy this growth story very easily. They see the silly gizmos, the cheap throwaways, and planned obsolescence create unnecessary pollution and gobble up resources that rightly belong to future generations. They know that infinite growth on a finite planet is a catastrophe already happening. Many of us share their concerns. So this, there is a pattern, you might recall as we've gone through this, to all the graphs we've seen. The growth curve is exponential. And on your screen here, you see a quilt done by Virginia, a beautiful quilt showing the exponential growth of our money supply. And the green portion of the graph where the dollar signs are represents the average increase of the actual money supply from 1913 to now. If you extend any graph of exponential growth, it develops this kind of curve. It may look slow, even manageable and beneficial at first, but then the curve starts to steepen and goes almost vertical. Since 1913, the money supply has grown on average a little under 7% every year, each year demanding more debt to create more money. And look where we are now. All kinds of borrowers have been recruited to accommodate this exponential growth imperative. In the 1950s, the US dollar became the global reserve currency, and credit cards appeared on the scene as the curve was beginning to head upwards. Our banks began to loan to college students and foreign governments in the 1960s. Women got the right to borrow money in 1972 as the need for borrowers grew and necessitated that the slope steepen. Today, lending back and forth in the financial sector with derivatives is off the charts, as it was before the last meltdown, which brings us to our current money system is inherently unstable. The demand for constant borrowing to keep the economy supplied with money means that there's no permanent money recirculating. When times are good and the economy seems to be growing, banks are eager to lend and people are willing to borrow, and the money supply expands. This can create this sort of booming stock or growth in the real estate market. And the longer those good times last, the more willing banks are to make riskier and riskier loans. But the debt burden on the productive economy gets heavier and heavier till it becomes overpowering. And when that happens, banks stop lending. And just when more money is needed to help people deal with the increased expenses, the banks decrease the money supply. Tight money results in business closures, reduced incomes, and job losses, and the economy spirals down. Defaults and general economic collapse result. Suffering is widespread. This boom and bust unstable economy is built in, and it threatens the well-being of all people, businesses, and government, though speculators love the volatility. In part, to keep the economy stable in this system, inflation is built in with a target rate of 2%. The rationale for this is to allow for steadiness and predictability while guarding against the risk of deflation. Deflation is much harder to deal with than inflation. In a deflation environment, people tend to hold money because they expect it to be more valuable in the future, and thus they spend less, and economic activity declines. But it is hard to keep intentional inflation within bounds, and painful corrections are the norm. This wouldn't have to be the case, but it is in this system. This graph, from left to right, shows the continual erosion of the value, the purchasing power of the dollar through inflation from the beginning of the Federal Reserve in 1913 on the left to 2019. And the pink lines are the recessions or depressions, which are, like I said, a predictable and recurring phenomenon in our current system. The constant gradual eroding of the value of our money by inflation would not be necessary if we had a money system where the supply was monitored and controlled directly rather than being dependent on the whims of bankers and borrowers, and we had perpetually circulating money supply. So another consequence is that wealth flows from the many to the few. Wealth transfers from borrowers to interest collecting lenders. The government borrows and money flows from taxpayers to bondholders. This system leads to exponentially increasing wealth disparity. WILF members work hard to reduce violence in the world. But when wealth and power are concentrated in the hands of the few and growing wealth disparity is built into the system, democracy is undermined, people feel increasingly powerless, and despair and violence increase. When the system demands that some people live in poverty and debt, that is in itself a form of violence. It's important for WILF to realize a money system that concentrates wealth is a root cause of violence. So this graph illustrates the flow of wealth from the many to the few in our country. On it, and it's mimicked in other countries. On it, you see the distribution of net worth or wealth at the top, and the 10%, which is the left 3 columns, you can see that from the stick figures underneath, they possess together 77%, more than 3/4 of the nation's wealth. If you go just to the far left column, the 1% of the population, it has 35% of US net worth. And the 3 columns at the right show the least wealthy 60% have only 12% of the wealth. Probably most of us, not all, but most of us live there. And the bottom 40%, some of us live there, own none of that. The concentration of wealth arises from several sources, including regressive taxation and monopoly pricing of goods. But the money system plays the most significant role, as the people on the right pay interest to those on the left, and not just through what we borrow, but through the price of everything we borrow. So all these factors are part of a self-reinforcing vicious circle. Wealth and power transfer from the many to the few. There's not enough money for the commons and very little money for prevention. Crises arise and expensive remediation is then mandatory. More debt is required. That is the system. And on that unhoping note, I pass on to Virginia for some happy news.
So what if the people had the power to create the money supply? How could it work? History provides some amazing and beautiful examples of money for the common good. Let me tell you a brief story. In 1817, at the close of the Napoleonic Wars, the island of Guernsey, a crown dependency of England, was in pitiful condition, physically and financially. They needed seawalls, roads, and a new marketplace with a roof. Their money was the pound sterling from England, but it was in short supply. A group went to the governor saying, "We need a new market, but we have no money to build it." The governor asked the group if they had the wood and stone needed to build the market. "Yes," they answered. "Do you have the workers to build it?" "Oh, yes, but we haven't the money." "Well, could not your parliament issue money?" the governor asked. The parliament agreed to issue a new currency that was paid to the workers and to the suppliers of materials, and it circulated in the economy. The market was completed in 1822 with no debt involved. The point is, of course, why should the nation be prevented from doing what it needs to do for its people by a lack of money? If the nation has the materials and labor, why should money be limiting? In 2021, the Ohio League of Women Voters engaged in an interesting process after studying the current money system. I participated in this effort, and we chose some features of a money system that would support the League's national goals. We developed them into a strong proposal presented at their national convention last June. And here's a sampling.
The money system would provide a convenient medium of exchange with ease of use for all. This is money's most basic purpose and a necessary feature of a money system. Another feature the League proposes is that the creation of the national money supply would not require increasing debt. They recognize that this is the core flaw of the existing system. The money system would enable a steady value of money in sync with the productive output of the economy, and it would assure that the economy would be stable, eliminating the worst extremes of booms and busts. The benefits of first use of new money would go for public good on purpose. No one would be systemically privileged. Money creation would be fair to all. The League group realized the silliness of, oh, we can't afford it, when the resources and labor are available to address a problem like climate change. The creation of money would no longer depend on economic growth. It could accommodate slow growth or no growth. And the national system of money, they said, could connect to the global and other national systems in a way that privileges no nation, allows people of all nations to benefit from the first use of their own money, and supports a sustainable future for all.
So a money system that has these features can be called a just money system. We call it just money because it is money that privileges no one. It is also just money, not debt carrying interest or transferring wealth. So AFJM, the Alliance for Just Money, was formed in 2018 based on 2 decades of popular research led by the 25-year-old think tank American Monetary Institute. AFJM is a democratically run membership organization promoting education and legislation for money reform. We are actively recruiting allies to join as individual or organizational members, and we see lots of mutual benefits in working together with WILF. You can check out the Alliance website, check out the Alliance for Just Money Facebook group. We welcome discussion there about the money system historically and in the news today. Our YouTube channel has recordings of our monthly coffee houses, which anyone is welcome to attend live. And we have a rich resource website with a multi-tiered bibliography and articles, blogs, news, and about money pages. Anyone can subscribe to our mailing list at monetaryalliance.org/subscribe. And we'll provide that info in the chat or in a follow-up email. So are you ready for an adventure into taller grass? We've done our best not to venture into the weeds, as they are sometimes called by monetary people. We've tried to pique your curiosity and hope that you want to learn more about the history and the events that led to the world's embrace, or at least the powerful in the world, of this fundamentally toxic system and how we can change it. We are working for a money system whose purpose is to keep wealth circulating and money circulating to spark creativity and support caring for the common good. In a study group, we'll let our imaginations go to work on possible healing futures, what we really want, and how we can remove the money obstacle. And we believe the next 2 to 3 years are crucial for monetary reform because central bankers and critical academics know things are problematic. There is a lot of pressure from private cryptocurrencies and likely corporate cryptocurrencies coming, like from Facebook and Amazon. So please join us now before it's too late and we miss this historical moment. And we have updated legislation that you can learn much more about, and we are working on getting introduced. Thank you.
Gremlins. So thank you for being here. And thank you to Mary Beth Garden and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and the Women, Money, and Democracy Group for the invitation to come, for the encouragement, and for all the publicity they did. Thank you to the Alliance for Just Money, to the Athens, Ohio League of Women Voters Money Study Group, to Marie Werner, who prepared some of the graphs at workableeconomics.com, and to Great Democracy Media. All made contributions that made this presentation possible. And I'd also like to just add at the end here, a personal thanks to Mary and Lucille. I thought we complemented each other's talents, and it was a lot of fun. We enjoyed working together to make this presentation for you. We hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you all very much. And please don't leave because this is the time for you to ask your questions, which we hope you've been making a note of. And before we do that, we have an exit poll for you to take. Please fill this out.
Oh, that wasn't supposed to be now. Sorry.
Do you want
That's
to
at the very end. Yeah.
wait to put
Okay,
that
we'll
up
wait until later.
Yeah, let's do that at the end. Let's do the Q&A now.
Yeah, because I bet people are just sitting there with all kinds of
Right. Yeah, the poll is for the end.
So the if you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand by using the Zoom raised hand function, or put your question in the chat and we'll call on you. And I see that Howard Switzer has his hand up. Go ahead, Howard.
Fantastic.
Oh, you're muted. Howard, you're muted.
Wonderful presentation, you all. I really appreciated that. I made a bunch of notes, but overall, I thought it was just great. And there was just a few things I thought that might add a little bit to it. And one was to point out that when we were talking about the booms and busts, we had a graph at one point that showed the money supply or something like that, but it showed the gray bands, you know, and then as Lucille did later on in the thing. So it's always gets covered. Every time I would make a note, it seemed like it would get covered. But one thing that didn't, what I thought was when that crash happens each time, that's a wealth transfer. And I don't think that was made clear, because they make money on the growth side and they make money on the bust side by picking up the collateral of the defaulted loans. And then the other thing that I think is an important point, and something that we never talk about hardly, is the psychological consequences of a money system. And there's research out there that is showing that it has an impact. And of course, the money that they're studying is the usury money that we use. And religions banned it for lots of reasons. And you mentioned that it was violence. And I thought Dante had a quote about that. He called it an extraordinary, efficient form of violence by which you do the most damage with the least effort. And I thought that was a good description of usury in our money system, which is a for-profit money system. And that's what usury is. So anyway, wonderful job. I thought you got across the message really good.
Thanks, Howard. And for everyone, usury is the biblical term for the collection of interest on loans. Diane Blay, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I thought this was so good. But I had 4 questions and I don't know if you want to take them all. But basically, at the Rage Against the War, I think it was last Sunday, Ron Paul said that we should get rid of the Federal Reserve and he thought that was key to ending wars. Does that kind of fit in with this or not? And okay, so then my next question is, who gets all this money the banks make? I mean, how is it decided? Is it by people that invest in banks? If that was the case, wouldn't everybody be investing in banks? And the third question is, did the League of Women Voters presentation, did that pass so that, no, I didn't think so, because it would be really good if it did. But anyway, and then do all countries use this system? Because you would think that some, well, that's okay. Well, I just don't see how all countries could be so off the mark. But anyway, those were my 4 things. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Diane.
The first question was about
Ending the Fed.
sorry,
If we're calling for ending the Fed.
right, right. And are you?
Not in the way that I think Rand Paul and his father were, because if you just leave the current banking system as it is, that solves nothing. So the current Fed is bank serving. It was it's not part of the government itself. You know, some of the leaders are chosen by the Fed, but the 12 Federal Reserve banks, the shareholders of them are the commercial banks, and they get automatic dividends every year. There is a portion of the earnings of the Fed at the end of every year that does go back to the government, but it's after they calculate all their expenses from it. There is a need for some kind of, we believe that money belongs in the public sector. Credit, the borrowing and lending of whoever surplus funds belongs in the private sector. And so if money itself, the understanding of what the supply should be, what the quantity, in order to facilitate the exchange of the productivity of the people whose name it bears, those decisions need to be made in the public sector, either by a unit of, it would be a unit of the Treasury in our system, an independent unit that we call a monetary authority, but it's wholly public, or a central bank that, like in other countries, most central banks started out as private, wholly private banks, but over time, almost all have become public. In the United States, it's not public. It's owned really by the commercial banks who are the shareholders. And so if there were a central bank, a public, wholly public central bank that did the work of understanding and recommending what amount of money must be created by Congress and either spent, lent, given, or what's the other one? Spent, lent, given, or invested into circulation for the public good. That's how it enters. And Congress would still create the money, but only in the amounts the monetary authority or public central bank determines. And they would determine for what, how, what is the public good? And we, the people, through our elected leaders, decide that. And there is a lot of discussion. I'll just say this at the end. There's a lot of content for one question, but there's something called central bank digital currency. You will be hearing more and more about it. We've issued, you can find on our website, comments to the public, to the Fed about a paper they issued a year ago now. Biden issued a executive order a year ago next month for his department, or the executive branches to cover it, to study central bank and digital assets. So stuff is going to come down. And we want it to be if it's a central bank, it's a wholly public central bank within the government. It's not bank serving. So I'll stop there and let somebody else take on a different question.
Well,
I was going to go to Diane's second question. Did you have more to add, Virginia, to the first?
I had just a quick thing to say about the first question about Rand Paul. I'm actually not familiar with his particular position, and eliminating the Fed means lots of things to different people. But the most important question to ask is, what does he mean by that? And who would be creating the money supply, and how would it be done? I mean, about anyone who's advocating any change in the money system, those are the two key questions. Well, then who will have the power and privilege to create the money, and how are they going to do it?
Thank you. So Diane, your second question then was, I wonder if you could restate it about who gets the money that the banks create? The people who borrow.
Well,
You-
also
So you're,
In the moment, when you sign that IOU, they put money in your checking account. You get to use it and circulate it in the economy during that time when you're paying it back. But you gotta pay back with interest. You gotta find it somewhere. And as you pay it back, both of those columns go down. Their asset shrinks, taking money out of the economy, and the money you have shrinks as you pay it back as well. So
Right,
also
but-
stockholders in the banks also get some of that money.
well, the interest that you scavenge out of the bigger economy and pay on that loan, that money goes to the bank's equity or stockholders, or they might recirculate it by spending it. The bank gets to do whatever they want with the interest. The principal, you get to use it, and then boom, it's gone.
You know, one of the arguments people make who like the current system is the argument that the creation of money is widely distributed between thousands of banks across the country, who all are each making decisions about who gets the first use of money. And they make that decision every time anyone comes in to borrow. The problem with that argument is that we have gone from, I can't remember now what the numbers were, but tens of thousands of banks when the 1913 Federal Reserve Act was written, to really 6 big banks that are creating the bulk of our money supply. And while they may be doing it to lots of different people across the whole country, their criteria for making loans is pretty much the same. And the top priority is for them to make a profit. That means they're going to need someone who already has collateral. They like proven businesses because you're more likely to get your money back if you're not loaning it to somebody trying to start something new. And all of this means that the new money going out is controlled by a fairly narrow segment of our population who is required by law as a for-profit business to make a profit for their shareholders.
Just on the 2 other questions quick, the League of Women Voters, yeah, it didn't pass the first time, but they got more than 150 votes. And that there's work now going on among other leagues similar to this kind of presentation, and the study groups were advocating. So this year and since the last convention, so that in the convention in 2024, the National Convention, it is raised again. It does make it to the conference floor, convention floor, and we hope it gets voted up as a national policy issue. We'll see. And do other countries have the system? Absolutely. The first time it was sanctioned as a legal system was in 1694, England, in the founding of the private Bank of England. And, you know, it was long in development before that, back, you know, from like the 1400s. It fueled the slave trade, really, the creation of money as credit. But it was institutionalized as it is in England and the US in 1913. And following World War II, the conferences, the Bretton Woods Agreement, it became, I mean, it was already elsewhere before that, but it's become a dominant system with the US dollar's role being predominant in that. And, but it's under crises now. People know it. And there's a lot of warmongering going on that is related to the money system underneath. I'll stop there. We should move on to other
Well,
questions.
and it's supported by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which
Right.
runs on the same principles so that everybody plays by these very unfair rules. There's
Those
a
were put into play in the Bretton Woods Agreement following World War II. That's when they started.
There's a question in the chat I wanted us to address. It says, so under this process, would the 1% be required to redistribute their wealth?
No,
Great.
What?
Yeah.
what we want to change is who creates the money and how it's done. And that over time would change the distribution of wealth. But Thomas Piketty in his book Capital noted that anytime people have money, they are more likely to accumulate even more. And addressing that would really be something that Congress would need to deal with. Our hope is that by taking away that power and privilege of money creation, that is so enormous, it would have an impact on the overall distribution of wealth.
Right. So what money reform is about is ending the systemic source of the 1%'s wealth and power, and maybe the 10%. It does not expropriate their wealth. That there may be a good argument for that. There is a good argument for reparations, but within the existing system, reparations will end up, in 8 years' time or so, back in the 1%'s pockets, that money. But if we get monetary reform, you can't conflate them together or you're going to kill monetary reform. This is the golden egg or the golden goose that lays the eggs. You have to address the systemic flaw. And, then it's a political question, the distribution, and it can happen in a variety of ways.
I want to try to get 2 more questions in. One is from Steve.
Mary Beth, Steve Olszewski has had his hand up for a long, long time.
That's
Thank
who I was
you.
just about to call on, Mary. Steve Olszewski, go ahead.
All right,
Cool,
thank
thank
you.
you.
Great presentation, ladies. Here's my question. I used to think that the amount of credit a bank could issue was determined by the amount of deposits that it had. I no longer think that. So what is it that limits how much credit a bank can issue?
Well, in theory, they are supposed to have 8% in equity. But when you look at, I looked at JP Morgan Chase's accounts maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when they only had $2.5 trillion in assets. And that was just after the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank had said, you have to have 8%. Well, they had 8% when they counted their goodwill and when they ignored everything that was in their off balance sheet, which was double. They had another $2.5 trillion off balance sheet, which meant they made it to the 4%, to the 8% in equity. But that currently is the only limitation. Mostly it doesn't even exist.
I'll
Because,
add to that.
okay, Mary wants to go on.
Do you want to finish? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
The main thing, the short answer to your question is they have to be able to meet their obligations every night when at the Fed, all the banks tally up with one another. They have to have enough in their reserves or be able to borrow it or use up some of their equity. And of course, if they use a lot of equity now, they weaken their position generally. So really the thing that limits bank lending is how much they can meet their nightly obligations with the other banks. Does that help you?
Yes, thank you.
And they do a
Okay.
lot of borrowing for that. anyway, yeah.
And Joe Polito, you have your hand up too, and then there's one more in the chat we'll get to before we close.
Thanks all for a wonderful presentation. You worked very well together. Virginia, I have a question for you. Joseph Huber suggested to us in one of his presentations that the central bank money can't be used by the general public. The only money we can really use is the bank money. And I wondered what proposal you might have or tweak you might have to make it possible to use that money, the central bank money, that is, other than cash. I guess we can use cash, but we can't use the central bank money, their digital money. Thank you.
The central bank, the Fed itself, in their paper recently on the central bank digital currency, made the comment that they defined money in a slightly different way by who, well, actually their categories were who got to create it. And they noted though, that the money created by the central bank, the money created by the private bankers is the same money. It's interchangeable. And the theories about central bank money being different from the other kind of money, I think those are useful as a way to look. They're really accounting structures and protocols. You know, this money is in a restricted account. It can only be used by so-and-so. But the kind of money is all the same. And the central bank, in the same way that my charts explained how a bank loans you $1,000 by making those two entries, that's exactly the same way the central banks, the Federal Reserve, makes loans to its member banks. The central bank takes their IOU and it drops the money in their account at the Fed. Now they have to maintain a certain amount of money at the Fed, but that's an accounting requirement. I mean, their reserves, what are called reserves, their account balances at the Fed can move back and forth between their own accounts and others. And you know, it's really getting into the weeds to look at that, those theories about central bank money.
One more question and then we'll close. Mike Caggiano wants to ask, do socialist-based countries have central banking run by the state rather than bankers themselves? Are any of us experts on central banking in socialist countries?
I'm not an expert, but I put in the chat, I believe the answer is yes, and it's sort of called state capitalism. And I think China is a very good example of it, and it's worth looking at. It's not all bad, I don't think. It's not all good. I'm not sure how different it is from how we create money, but I'm not an expert on China. But I did hear there is a very interesting interview. I put, email reform@monetaryalliance.org and ask for it. I'll find the link in the analysis.news. Mary, is that your hand?
Yeah. I'm not an expert either at all. But I do agree that of all the countries we know of, China seems to be the one that does have more government control over banking than others. In other countries that you might call socialist, I don't know which ones you're talking about, but the big banks, European banks and US banks, have a presence. You can travel all over Latin America and find Citibank and the Bank of Santander, and they are a huge presence doing the same thing they do here everywhere. So as far as government control over banking, it's pretty minor, and I would say mostly in China. And I encourage you to follow up on that question and look at that specifically. I think it's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming tonight and for your good questions for our speakers. We hope that you learned a lot about how working together can transform money to make it work for the common good. Don't leave just yet. We're asking you to do a very short exit poll that Lucille will post right now. Please just take a couple of minutes to fill it out, and we'll use this information to ensure that these programs are conveying as much information as we intend, and people are understanding most of it. And you can indicate your interest in staying with this subject and learning still more about how to make money work for good, just money. So while you complete this, let me tell you that Wilf is presenting on Thursday, March 9th at 7 p.m. Eastern, our One Wilf call, and our speaker will be Caroline Hussein, who will be explaining another aspect of alternative banking. It's called Meet the Banker Ladies. She's a specialist in women immigrants and women in developing countries who are developing mutual aid and community banking, savings and loans. I'll put the registration for that in the chat.
So we're just really thrilled you all came as well. And take as long as you need for the poll, but it will be helpful if you can do it just to give us some immediate feedback and also a sense of interest that might be out there in the study group. But we will follow up with participants with an email message in a week or so. But thanks for coming.
On behalf of the Alliance for Just Money and Women, Money and Democracy, National Committee of Women, Money and Democracy, thank you for your time and attention. And this recording will be posted on YouTube channels for both of our organizations. Thanks so much. Have a good night and a good weekend. Bye, everybody.